In a recent viewing of Shakespeare's Henry V, it stood out to me how Shakespeare made a point of conveying the chivalry and ethics of medieval combat in his plays. The plot of Henry V explores the morality of King Henry and is centered around the historic Battle of Agincourt, which occurred on October 25th, 1415, or on St. Crispin's Day. Shakespeare writes King Henry as a chivalrous and also morally questionable hero, and while the small details of the battle are a tool to help paint who he is as a character, I want to take a brief foray into studying the battle itself. The Battle of Agincourt was part of the 100 Years' War between England and France. During the battle, English forces were heavily outnumbered, as Shakespeare recalls, saying that they were numbered 5-1. While historians still disagree on the actual numbers of troops in the battle, it can be speculated that there were somewhere between 6,000 to 9,000 Englishmen versus a force of 14,000 to 30,000 Frenchmen. Some sources suggest that there were only 600 casualties on the English side versus the 6,000 French deaths, while Shakespeare boasts that there were only 29 English deaths versus the 10,000 French deaths. While these different historical accounts are wildly imprecise and inconsistent, and historians still don't agree whether the English were outnumbered 2-1 or 5-1, the case remains that the English were heavily outnumbered and their victory was astounding. On my initial viewing of the play, I was dumbfounded by these numbers. It's really hard to rationalize such a victory being founded upon nothing but English soldiers being inspired by King Henry's St. Crispin's Day speech and then proceeding to go sicko mode. But it is an incredible speech, to be fair. And I've never been in a battle, so maybe that is just kind of how it works, I don't know. But the actual key to this victory is one that became signature of medieval English forces, and only became apparent with a little bit of extra digging. That the English army is said to have contained about 1,500 heavily armored foot soldiers, and about 7,000 archers. Now, I could go into expansive details on the logistics of having 7,000 arrows flying at your forces again and again, while trying to push through this small but formidable force of 1,500 soldiers. But ultimately, I think the numbers, as confusing as they are, speak for themselves. In any case, Henry V's archer force led to an incredible victory, which got me thinking about the morality of this. People love stories about the underdog rising to win a battle against all odds, as there's a sort of magic in this, of defying what seems possible and overcoming forces that seem indomitable, because stories like that tell us that our own hopeless situations may not be as grim as we think. But if, say, 5,000 British men lived and 10,000 Frenchmen were killed as a result of this strategy, is that really, a good thing? But it was this line of rationale that got me to start thinking about military techniques that were perhaps too effective, such as gas warfare, and how arrow rain compares. As I discovered with a bit more research, chemical warfare does not really relate to arrow volley combat, as the reason chemical warfare was outlawed was the psychological effects it had and the unnecessarily painful deaths it caused. Frenchmen can shake their fists at the cowardice of archery versus facing them in hand-to-hand combat all they want, but at the end of the day, what it boils down to is good strategy. What does relate to Henry V, however, is war crimes. Even though Henry V's publication predates the United Nations' first official establishment of modern war crimes by some 300 years, Shakespeare seems to be keenly interested in the practice of moral engagement in combat.
Kill the boys in the luggage. 'Tis expressly against the law of arms.
Constantly in Henry V, Shakespeare makes a point of King Henry being careful to wage war morally in some ways and not in others. From the very first scene, Shakespeare portrays that the war was caused by the Bishop of Canterbury tricking King Henry into war, so that while the king was distracted, the bishop wouldn't lose land and could get away without having to pay the taxes that new policies asked for. So from the beginning, the moral standing of this war is on shaky ground, if not downright corrupt. There are many ways that the story fixates on moral combat, such as how painstakingly Henry insists on respecting the French messenger, until the French commit a war crime of their own, that is, or how strict he is that they don't pillage the French countryside to the point that he hangs an old and dear friend of his for stealing a loaf of bread.
We would have all such offenders so cut off. And we give express charge that in our marches through the country, there be nothing compelled from the villages, nothing taken but paid for, none of the French upbraided or abused in disdainful language. For when lenity and cruelty play for a kingdom, the gentler gamester is the soonest winner.
But there are many ways that he also fails to wage war in a moral way. Aside from the corruption at the heart of the war's origins, Act 3 and Scene 4 in particular, well, maybe I should just show you.
Soldier, with foul hand, defiled the locks of your shrill, shrieking daughters. Your fathers taken by the silver beards and their most reverend heads dashed to the walls. Your naked infants spitted upon pikes, whilst the mad mothers, with their howls confused, do break the clouds! What say you? Will you yield? And this avoid?
In modern media, especially in the age of video games, someone can kill 100 people and be considered a hero rather than a murderer, but oftentimes war crime violation is used to portray a character's villainy, even if we don't consciously recognize that as the case. What is especially interesting is when characters who are easily labeled as the good guys are seen committing war crimes and they contradict our previous assumptions. Henry V is one of those characters, and I think that it is here that Shakespeare demonstrates a piece of his genius. Sometimes when we look at old Shakespeare plays, it's easy to see something weird that a character does and say, well, I guess that they didn't really know what was right and wrong back then. But I think that even in Shakespeare's time, his threat to burn and rape and pillage was not really signifying him being a good guy. I mean, I think you could make the claim that this is a blatant use of, terrorism and fear tactics. But I think that in this case, even though King Henry forces this surrender with terrorism, and it does result in less deaths on both sides, it kind of shows two possibilities of his character as a conqueror, and in our imaginations creates two versions of Henry V. Shakespeare demonstrates that there is a monstrous part of Henry V, and the character who would have done those horrible things very well could have existed. And he is a character who, as we know from how sternly he refuses to pillage after the surrender is made, keeps his word with deadliness. By admitting that this is a possibility, Shakespeare communicates that King Henry is a human being who can make choices rather than just a character in a play, and makes the fact that he chooses good when he doesn't have to that much more noteworthy. Now, I'd just like to end off by admitting that judging Henry V on the basis of war crimes established some 500 years after his death is a little dubious. But when my dad discovered that I was talking about this, he brought me this cool tome about chivalry, which in my mind shows how similar the code of chivalry, or the militant parts of it that is, are to what we observe as modern war crimes. Just as war crimes are frequently observed to varying degrees, the book expresses that the code of chivalry was rarely faithfully lived up to, and since, as a German philosopher has said, the ideals cherished in the minds of men enter into the characters of their actions. Amid all the treachery, greed, and cruelty, there are to be found shining examples of unselfish courage, gentleness, and mercy inspired by those rules that only a perfect man could keep perfectly. Cool. Thanks for watching.